Thank you so much for joining us this evening for what is a special one-off lecture. I am fronting up, but there's a team of people who've been involved in putting this analysis together. In particular, Gareth Poole, who's somewhere here, James Griffiths, who's sitting in the front here, and Jack Lanner, who couldn't be here at all, heavily involved, and if anything's wrong, I'm going to blame them for that. You will note, first of all, just on the slide, that the title of the thing on the slide is slightly different from the title as advertised, because the Senedd, in their infinite wisdom over the last 2 days, have objected to us having Labour dominance in the title. Which I don't know whether I should laugh or cry or get really annoyed at their attempt to take politics out of the life of the Senedd. And it's also, if they're worried that people are going to be offended, people in other parties are going to be offended, but they don't need reminding that Labour's won every election for 100 years, and they tend to be the people who are most interested in finding out why. So the real title is, why does Labour win in Wales again and again and again? I ran out of agains, basically. So you will have heard quite a lot of this today, but it is worth just noting and detailing the extent of the achievement that we're talking about. Because this is something, we have that slight paranoia of small nations that we keep saying that we're unique in this and that. And we over-egg the uniqueness of Wales. But this is where we are genuinely unique, because this is, as you know, the 100th anniversary of Labour having that first victory in the 1922 general election. And it's a fate they have repeated in every election, general election since then, winning at least a plurality of the votes in every single UK general election, and winning actually a majority of the vote 9 times. And that's genuinely extraordinary. They won a plurality of the seats and votes in every devolved election since 1999. And as you mentioned, Keir Starmer, it's worth reminding ourselves just how dramatically different the Welsh Labour record is from Labour's record in England. Labour have won a plurality of the votes in England only 7 times in that whole period. So, you know, it's extraordinary when compared to England. And what's even more remarkable, and I think this is something to bear in mind, this is not just Labour. I did an event with the First Minister in the Eisteddfod, which was a lot of fun, talking about this stuff. And somebody asked us, why do Labour keep winning in Wales? And my slightly facetious answer was, because they're not the Conservatives, right? And this is the point. This 100 years of dominance followed on from 60 years of Liberal dominance. The Conservatives last won an election in Wales in 1859. 1859, in the thoroughly pre-democratic era. So it's not just that we've got 100 years of Labour dominance, we've got 160 years of, if you like, progressive politics dominating electorally in Wales. To put that into perspective, the only other place that comes anywhere close at either state or sub-state territory is obviously it's at the tip of your tongue, the South Tyrolean People's Party, who've won every election in that largely German-speaking part of northern Italy for 74 years. And then you go to the CSU in Bavaria. But, you know, as I keep saying, even if Labour stopped winning today, and there's no sign that they're going to do that, it would take, you know, a couple, I mean, it's 2.5 decades to catch up with this record. It's extraordinary. The only places that can actually compare in terms of winning for 100 years, or more or less, are some Mexican states where the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is the best party name ever in the world, where the PRI have been winning for a very long time, but Mexico hasn't been democratic during that period. Or you've got the Democrats winning in the southern states of the US post-Civil War, the solid South, okay? But again, that was a period where the Jim Crow policies were closing black people off from the franchise. Welsh Labour's dominance has gone hand in hand with expanding the franchise and equalising the franchise. So it's gone hand in hand with democratisation. So it's a completely different case from what we see in Mexico or what you saw in the solid South. This is why I keep saying Welsh Labour is the most successful electoral machine in the democratic world when you stress democratic. Now, in terms of trying to understand why this might be the case, from the early days of kind of political science engagement with elections and with electoral behaviour, there's been a recognition that Wales is different. So if you go back to the kind of early 1960s when this stuff really gets going, you've got somebody like Blondell pointing to Wales, a definite Labour stronghold. Butler, who died, David Butler, of course, who died sadly the other day. Butler and Stokes in that kind of classic, the most anti-conservative area in all of Britain in that period. And then we've got one of the very first contributions on voting in Wales by a guy called Kevin Cox, who went on to become one of the most famous Marxist geographers. There is such a thing as Marxist geography. I actually spoke to him recently about this work. Anyway, he published a really interesting piece in one of the formative texts of global political science, edited by Allart and Rokkan. Stein Rokkan was a famous Norwegian political scientist who spent all his summer holidays in St David's for various strange reasons. Anyway, he was looking at voting in Wales up until the late 1950s. Levels of left-wing voting in Wales, defining left-wing as including the Liberal Party and the Communists, are highly underpredicted when regressed on social class. So his point was, it's not just about the class composition of Wales, okay? Labour do better in Wales than you might expect, given the class composition of Wales. So this has been noted going back to the 1960s. It was impossible to do any serious work on elections in Wales until the 1979 Welsh election study. That's the time we get the first individual level data. And as many of you political nerds will know, people like Dennis Balsam, then based in Aberystwyth, did some really path-breaking work on electoral behaviour in Wales, and obviously trying to explain why Labour did so well in Wales. And their explanation hinged on two things: Welsh national identity and what they called cultural attachment. So especially amongst those people who feel Welsh, their kind of alignment with traditional markers of Welsh culture, so language, non-conformist religion, and so on and so forth. And they developed this understanding of voting behaviour in Wales using national identity and cultural attachment as the key kind of explanans. And then Dennis popularised this as the Three Wales model, which all of you, I'm sure, will have heard about. And just very, very quickly, the way that the model works is at the individual level, and they divide between people who feel Welsh and feel British. So obviously the survey asks a bunch of questions, and one is what's your sense of national identity? And then they develop something called the cultural attachment scale, which is 8 questions about things like, you know, do you go to chapel? Do you speak Welsh? Do your parents speak Welsh? Do you watch Welsh news media, and so on and so forth? And so basically, you then develop a kind of very simple 4-box matrix. Amongst those people who feel British, they argue that voting behaviour is the same as the rest of Britain. Interestingly, in 1979, Scotland wasn't that different, okay? So it's the same pattern as across the rest of Britain. But then, amongst those people who feel Welsh, The Conservatives do horribly. Okay? But then there's a distinction between those people who feel Welsh and have high levels of cultural attachment, where Labour is strong but Plaid Cymru is competitive, and then amongst those people who feel Welsh but have low levels of cultural attachment, Labour is completely dominant. Okay? And that's then transposed onto this map. And this map is the famous one. This is the one that's reeled out after every election in Wales. And basically, it's basically a bastardization or a popularization of that model that I showed you just before. So basically what Dennis Balsam said was, these types of people tend to live in these places, okay? But it's not a geographical model. Those students of mine who are in this room, it's not a geographical model, okay? It's an individual level, which is then, there's no reason in principle why people who are strong Welsh identifiers with strong cultural identity behave different in Caldicot than Caernarfon, okay? It's just where there tend to be more people living. Anyway, there's my bit of lecturing. So this was it, because after 1979, there was no money to do any further research on this until 1997, okay? So basically, this was the last word until people like me and David Trystan came along back in 1997. So, and since then, we've been collecting data on a very regular basis, and then have been various contributions to the literature which have helped kind of push this stuff along. One of which, and one of the early contributions, was showing that Welsh identifiers not only regard Conservatives as the English party in Wales, but actually being anti-conservative, the kind of sense of negative partisanship, is part of one of the markers of what makes people feel Welsh. Now, of course, and I need to underline this, there are exceptions. I know some very rich farmers in Anglesey who can barely speak English, but nonetheless, and who are very, very proud to be Welsh, but nonetheless vote for the Conservatives. The First Minister is shaking his head in deep disappointment to my left here. But anyway, for most people in Wales, most Welsh identifiers view being anti-conservative as part of a marker of Welsh identity. And when we published that, that got a lot of traction amongst Conservative members of the then National Assembly who were trying to work out what to do. There's also then been a critique of the Three Wales model, in particular some of the stuff around cultural attachment and how the technical details of that. You could also argue that actually that's very backward looking. The development of Welsh medium education and so on and so forth may be changing that. But also then crucially there have been major developments in how you measure identity. So back in 1979, people were forced to choose between being British, Welsh, English, and it was a forced choice. The reality of this is lots of people have got kind of mixed sense of identity, nested identity. So some people feel Welsh, very Welsh and a little bit British, or mainly British, but they will talk about a British identity. So something called the Moreno scale was developed to try and understand that kind of sense of nested identity. We've subsequently discovered that identity strength is really important politically. We also have recognised over time that Englishness and Britishness are not the same thing. This is really important in Wales. 27% of the Welsh electorate are born in England. So potentially at least identify as English. So that's a very significant chunk of people. And some of you may know I've written a book about Englishness and what that's doing politically. Britishness and Englishness are not the same thing, and lots of the early analysis assumed that they were. Okay? We also know that Britishness doesn't mean the same thing in different parts of the UK, or it means different things depending on what sub-state identity it's interacting with. So very crudely, if you live in Islington and say you're British, not English, that means something different from living in Pembroke and saying, I'm British, not Welsh. That Britishness aligns with very different things, as I'll show you in a moment. So basically what we have in Wales is an extremely complicated pattern of national identity. We're the most heterogeneous of all the 4 territories of the UK in terms of identity. You've got Welshness, you've got Britishness, you've got Englishness, all interacting with each other. Just to give you a sense of this complexity, I'll just differentiate between a Welsh identity complex and an English identity complex. So we've got, and the proportions on the right are the proportions of a sample from the 2021 Welsh election study. So around 30% feel Welsh only, around 20-odd% feel equally Welsh and equally British, strongly Welsh and strongly British. Around 7% feel who could identify as Welsh. So these are basically people born in Wales, okay? But identify as British only, that's around 7%. And then, in terms of the rest, we've got English only, British English, so strongly English, strongly British, and then people who feel British, not English. So people born in England who eschew an English identity. I call them Cardiff academics, basically, to give you a sense of who I'm talking about. And then you've got everybody else, okay? So that's just a sense of the sheer heterogeneity of the population. And just some of you, especially maybe some people from the Labour Party who are here, be going, you're talking about national identity all the time, Jones. It's actually all about class. So this is just by the by, just to give you a sense. This is, you ask people in surveys what identities matter to them, and you give them a choice of 3, just to make it easier for us to calculate, okay? And so this is, in order, what people talk about. And so parent is the number 1, okay? After that, it's Welsh, and then it's British. English also makes it in to the kind of the top ones. So that's more important than Remainer and Leaver. Some people argue that that's the political identity, or that's the identity that counts increasingly. It's more important than gender, hometown, even spouse, partner. I always think that's very funny. It's more important to be Welsh than to be somebody's spouse or partner, apparently. So anyway, or partisan of a particular party or whatever. What you find is, if you ask people what identities matter to them, national identity is really powerful, okay? So, where are we? So, what I'm going to try to do is use the data that we've got going back eventually over 42 years, going back to that 1979 data, to try and give you a sense of what explains this remarkable record of success. My starting point is it makes no sense to explain this unbroken record of success on the basis of the popularity of a particular leader or a particular policy. You know, over 100 years, really? The literature is very clear that national identity is important in both positive and negative ways. So partisanship, but also negative partisanship. I'm not them, okay? But that doesn't explain why national identity aligns with Labour voting for such a lengthy period. And also, of course, one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that this stuff isn't static. So national identity and its political effects are not static. The relationship, for example, between Welsh identity and attitudes to devolution has changed fundamentally over the years. Back in 1979, Welsh identifiers were no more likely than anybody else to vote for devolution. Everybody was against it, more or less, okay? Now there's a very, very strong... So this isn't static. So we need to understand how these changes work and how Labour can still keep winning despite the fact that this isn't static, okay? So what I'm going to do I'm going to start by just showing you a bunch of data, and I hope you can all see it. It's the patterns of the thing, not the detail. What I've done is divided the Welsh electorate into those born in England and those born in Wales to get the English identity complex and the Welsh identity complex. This is not perfect. There are lots of people who are not born in Wales who feel Welsh. I was born in blinking America, okay? And I feel very strongly Welsh, okay? So I don't fit in here at all, okay? But we're not after everybody here. We're trying to get general understanding of trends. And what I've got here is how people voted in the devolved election in May 21. This is a sample of, this is an enormous sample, 4,000, biggest we've ever done in Wales. This is really good data, okay? Or these are really good data if you're a purist. And what we've got, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time just explaining, on the left-hand side, born in England, and then on the bottom, on the x-axis, along the bottom, people feel British only. People in the middle feel strongly British and strongly English. People on the right feel strongly English only. And then on the right-hand side, we've got, this is for people born in Wales, people who feel British only, people who feel strongly Welsh and strongly British, people who feel strongly Welsh only. And then, obviously, the colours are red is Labour, blue are the Conservatives, plaid are green, the self-immolation of the Lib Dems means I don't have to bother with them, so that makes it a little bit more easy to visualise. And these get wider towards the end because there are fewer people there, okay? So this is in terms of probability, predicted probability of voting, okay? And so as there are fewer people towards the end, it kind of opens out, okay? And so in terms of understand where the Labour's votes come from, well, on the born in England side, there's not much in it, frankly. Labour's advantage is clearly on the right hand of the screen, and it's amongst those people who feel strongly Welsh, either strongly Welsh or strongly British, or towards strongly Welsh only. And notice Plaid Cymru, you know, the Tories on the Welsh, on the born in Wales side do best amongst those born in Wales who feel British only. Their support plunges to nothing basically amongst those who feel Welsh only, and Plaid come up right at the end amongst those who feel only Welsh. This, if you're interested, if a general election, a UK general election had been held in May, this is what the vote would look like, just to confirm that the pattern is broadly similar. You know, the nerds will want to look at this in some detail, but basically, Labour support is there, okay? Now, in terms of trying to understand why Labour does well, what I've got here is there's a very simple, this is adapted and simplified, Michigan model of voting. This goes back to the kind of foundation of the social scientific study of elections and the American election study in Michigan. And they had this idea that ultimately these things, there's a kind of socio-demographic underpinning of the votes, but then as you get more proximate to the act of voting, you start thinking about leaders and policies. So this is a kind of this is quite an old-fashioned model for understanding vote choice. And what I want to show you is that national identity has an effect on every single element in that kind of funnel. Okay? So you look at each one of those, and national identity has a really significant impact in shaping leaders and policy assessments, our views about our values, our views about the nature of the polity we want to live in, devolved, non-devolved, part of the European Union, not part of the European Union. Cultural inheritance, I mean things like language and religion, social group identities, class, okay? All of those things relate significantly to national identity in the Welsh context. So I'm going to scoot through these. This is leader assessments in Wales back in 2021. Again, on the born in England side, well, it's kind of interesting, but all the action is really on the other side. And so again, for those of you at the back, blue is Andrew R.T. Davis, red is Mark Drakeford, and green is Adam Price, and what you see amongst, on the right-hand side, those people with a strong Welsh identity tend to be much more favourable towards Adam Price and Mark Drakeford. And actually, it's interesting how close Adam Price and Mark Drakeford are in terms of perceptions. And that goes back to something which some people don't like me saying in both parties, are that Labour voters and Plaid voters tend to like each other's leaders more than you might imagine, or some people might imagine. So these are Welsh leader ratings. You can see a very strong, very obvious relationship. So Andrew R.T. Davies does best amongst those people in Wales who feel British, strongly British, not Welsh. Okay? Here are assessments of blue is Boris Johnson, red is Sir Keir Starmer, and this, I thought this would be fun. Nicola Sturgeon is the green here. And what you see is that, unsurprisingly, born in England, Boris Johnson does better amongst those people with a strong English identity. Very strong relationship between Conservative support and English identity in England. You also find it in Wales. I love the fact, I think it's just so objectively really funny that Nicola Sturgeon is more popular than Keir Starmer amongst those people who feel strongly Welsh only. But anyway, so these are the relationships. Then these are, sorry, there's a mistake here. I just realised there's a mistake here. On the y-axis, it's very well at the top and very badly. So I got this completely the wrong way around, okay? So this is COVID lockdown evaluation. Done well, done badly. So Welsh government is red, UK government is blue. On the Born in England side, the Welsh government is seen as doing better, which I think is really quite striking. But look at the other side. Look how national identity shapes people's perceptions of who was doing well in the lockdown. And that's genuinely remarkable. As an aside, I do wonder if the fact, I think that the Welsh Conservatives got the, how can I put this politely, got the tone of their response to the Welsh government's approach to COVID quite wrong. And I do wonder if it reflected who the Conservative Party base in Wales is likely to be. The only group in Wales who thought that the UK government was doing a better job than the Welsh government. Here's an important one. Cares about people like me. Kind of a generic, but nonetheless quite striking. And look at that. Again, well, it's incredibly clear. And look again how strongly on the Welsh side, both Labour and Plaid mirror each other and tend to think that the Welsh level is doing a better job. Then attitudes to the polity, the nature of the polity. So what we've got here is Home Rule, so support for devolution up to independence. And then we've got Vote Leave, okay? Voted Leave in 2016. And what you see is, in terms of, on the Born in England side, support for autonomy doesn't really vary across, it's just pretty flat. But support for leaving the EU increases the more English you feel. Well, written a book about that. It's not a surprise, okay? But it also happens in Wales amongst the 27% of the Welsh electorate born in England. But then look on the Born in Wales side, the people who feel British, not Welsh, are very, very hostile to devolution. Really hostile to devolution, would like it to go away, basically. Those people who feel Welsh only now are more than likely to vote to support independence. But that's such a steep gradient. And then a slightly less steep gradient on the other side in terms of supporting membership of the EU. So the more British you feel, the more likely you were to vote for leave. We'll come back to Europe right towards the end. Just worth pointing out, just to tease this for you, is that Welsh identifiers have become substantially more pro-European since 2016. Okay, it's now becoming part of I'll talk about that in a moment. Right, what else have we got? Very quickly, left-right and libertarian, authoritarian. Actually, this is probably a better slide just to show you this. So what we've got here are these different national identity groups, rather than doing these trends, because I think this is more clear. Welsh only tend to be more liberal and more left-wing. So the x-axis here is left to right. The y-axis is more liberal to more authoritarian. These are very standard questions asked in surveys all over the world. I've also added in other there, just if you're interested, because that's around 20% of the Welsh population. So Welsh only tend to be more liberal, more left-wing. Then you've got the British Welsh, who tend to be more authoritarian, and the British only, not Welsh, more to the right. And then, interestingly, the English identity cluster in Wales maps almost exactly onto the English identity cluster in England itself. So there's no big left-right differentiation related to national identity in England, but there's a libertarian, authoritarian one. So people who feel British, not English, tend to be more liberal, socially liberal, okay? Which I don't think is a surprise to anybody. Finally, is this finally? No, not quite finally, not quite finally. So class is interesting. So this is people's subjective sense of class. So you ask people, do they feel working class, middle class, or aristocrats? I obviously tick that box. But what you find is that people who identify as Welsh are more likely to identify as working class, no matter what their objective class status, no matter what their income or place in the production process, they're more likely to identify as working class. And there's I've spoken about this elsewhere, there's the class and nation narratives interpenetrate themselves in Wales in a way that's often the case in stateless nations. And if you stop being, if you leave the Gwerin or the working class behind, that you're somehow dodgy, you're not properly Welsh anymore, quite possibly, right? So these narratives intertwine, and we find, going back through the data, that those people who feel Welsh are more likely to identify as working class, no matter what their income is. Finally, very, very quickly on this, language and religion, because obviously if you go back to, I mentioned liberal dominance, obviously non-conformist religion was really important in underpinning that. We've got to the stage there are so few non-conformists in Wales that they don't even come up in the data. There aren't enough to do anything with them anymore. But we've got Anglicans, we've got some Anglicans, and of course we've got at least one in the audience. And of course Anglicanism historically was associated with conservatism in Wales, with the landlords, with all that stuff, Elaine Morgan. And liberalism and non-conformism were seen as much more closely allied, and Welsh identity was seen as closely allied. And then that's basically gone. That's basically gone. It's all very flat there. But you're not surprised to see that Blue, which is speaking Welsh, you find more Welsh speaking towards the Welsh only end. Well, shock horror. So, right, where does this leave us all? So we've observed so far, excuse me. We've observed so far that in Wales, different elements along that kind of funnel of causality. It's kind of, I'm trying to do this visually because lots of stats would bore you to tears and bore me to tears. All of these elements along this funnel of causality align with national identity. And you can then model that formally using factor analysis. And what you find is that these various elements highlighted co-vary or align with each other to form what we call a Welsh worldview. And in the book on Englishness, we talked about an English worldview and how that has been so important in terms of Brexit and all the things which have happened in the UK over the last few years. And what's interesting is the Welsh worldview is in many ways the mirror image of the English worldview. And in terms of understanding why Labour keep winning, what's interesting is that these elements that align with Welsh national identity as part of this worldview push people in a progressive direction. So subjective working class identity, left-wing values, more liberal values, being pro-autonomy. These are things which are kind of push in a progressive voting direction. And the more Welsh a voter feels, the less likely she or he is to vote for the Conservatives. That negative partisanship thing going on there. And the more likely they are to support Labour until any sense of Britishness dissipates, where Plaid becomes very competitive. So in terms of the factor analysis and what elements of the strongest relationship with this Welsh worldview, self-placement, left-wing self-placement is the most important then. Pro-autonomy, you prioritise Welshness over Britishness. Pro-European, left-wing actually objectively, so you ask people a set of questions and what do they answer. So not just where do you place yourself on a left-right spectrum, but a response to actual questions. And then you've got liberal values, and then you've got this subjective working class identity. And a kind of negative, I'm not middle class. So, I realise that some of you got to go to supper, so I wanted to try and draw this to a close. But I've got some cool stuff to show you, I think. Because so far, the focus has been on 2021, using 2021 data to try, which is the best survey we've ever done, the biggest, the best, and so gives us the most possibilities in terms of the analysis. But obviously, your response to me might well be, well, that's 2021, Richard. We've got, there were 99 years before that, okay? And of course, there are limits, hard limits to what we can do, because we haven't got any data before 1979. We can't invent that data. But we can go back to 1979. We then have really pretty serious data from 1997 on. And I'm not going to show you this now, but I can at the end if you want to. But what you see is that this Welsh worldview associates with vote choice in the same way for every single election we've got data for, right back to 1979. Okay? So going right back to 1979, the Conservatives and Plaid do well at the polls, okay? But Labour do well in the middle, basically, okay? And that's where most people are, which is quite helpful for Labour. But also then, because I've made this argument that all of these values align now with Welsh identity in particular ways. You can actually, using a slightly different statistical technique, and James will have to explain this in detail, technical detail, to you afterwards if you're so inclined, although I might go to the pub at that point. Something called item response theory you can use to actually visualize how the relationship between the various variables I've spoken about and the Welsh worldview changes over time. And what you see is that some things are fairly static. So the relationship between Welsh national identity, Welsh language, ability, subjective class, that doesn't really vary, okay? That remains a solid part of the worldview throughout. But there are other things that wax and wane. So religion has clearly changed over time. So back in 1979, Anglicanism was associated with Britishness positively and more negatively with the Welsh worldview, okay? So that has changed over time. I think it's probably your influence, Lynette. Europe, there was no relationship between Welsh worldview and Europe back in 1979, is now really strongly related to that. So I've got 3 animations, which they're not that. It's not Super Ted, okay? Sorry, don't get your hopes up. So this is national identity, and the worldview is along the bottom there. So lowest level of worldview, highest, and then In 1979, it's British, Welsh and Englishness, and then we move to dual identity. And what you see basically is that that relationship with Welsh identity and worldview, highest level of worldview, is pretty constant over time. Okay? Anglicanism, as I said, that relationship gets weaker over time. So back in 1979, the first data that we have, I wish we had data from the 1950s or the 1920s. That would have been really so interesting to see. But what you see is that that relationship kind of falls away. And obviously sadly we don't have data on non-conformity, but yeah, it's kind of died effectively socially. This is amazing. This is Europe in 1979. That's where we are now with Europe. Okay, so it's moved from being that it was not part of the Welsh worldview in any way, shape or form, and then over time it's become this really strikingly thing. And there's lots of stuff that we can talk about in terms of why that might be the case. So final slide, and thank you for bearing with me, especially those people who I know have to go. Is this the final slide? Yes, it is. So trying to draw all of this together, and obviously there's a lot more analysis under the bonnet, so there's a lot more clever stats being done by other people, not me, under the bonnet of all of this. But I've tried to present this in a way that's kind of visually understandable. So where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us basically with the realization that Welsh national identity co-varies, aligns with a set of attitudes, social identities, values, beliefs about the nature of the political community, the Welsh worldview, which motivate particular patterns of vote choice and push people in particular, we're trying to explain not just 100 years of Labour domination, but 160 years of progressive political domination in Wales, okay? And the argument is that these things align with Welsh identity in ways that push people in particular directions and away from other directions. And those people in Wales who could embrace Welsh identity, so in the terms of this presentation, people born in Wales, very obviously, who reject Welsh identity tend to reject the associated worldview, as you saw very clearly. And of course, the other thing to really underline is that the way that these attitudes, social identities, values, beliefs, etc., associate with Welshness is not static. Some elements remain the same. The relationship with Welsh identity is obviously a bedrock. The Welsh language is important. Subjective sense of class appears to be important. This intertwining of nation and class narratives in Wales. But other things fade. Nonconformism has faded. Religion more generally has faded. Other things are then absorbed into it, like support for home rule, like liberal values. I was brought up in a rural village in Ynys Môn, which I didn't realise at the time was a bastion of liberal values, okay? But it turns out that we've become more liberal over time, and now pro-EU sentiment is coming up on the rails in a really interesting way. So it's the dynamic association of these factors with Welshness, and of course the persistence of Welsh identity that is the foundation of Labour's hegemony in Wales. Diolch yn fawr.